What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. This is the Elder Scrolls podcast. I'm Scott, here with Michael and Drew as always, and today we are tackling the big one. We are doing Imperials versus Stormcloaks. And as far as I'm aware, we're not taking any particular side. It's kind of like, circling around all the different ideas and so on. And we want to basically discuss both sides, the benefits of sides, whether it's like their rhetoric or like culture or even the practical elements. Like, we're kind of going to discuss it all, but there'll be a lot of like devil as advocate playing here. Like, we don't just want to go like, oh yeah, this side, yeah, they're the right one, they're the good guys or so on, because I'm excited to talk about, but everyone, I feel like there's a very dominant sort of Imperials are undisputably the good guys and everything's great about them. And it's kind of like picking the best of two bad options rather than just this sort of...
We're going full season unending mode where we're just sitting in the middle listening to all the good points and bad points for both, and we're not 100% taking sides. I mean, my Falmor robes are in the wash, so can't take their side.
I suppose they all suck is one of the points we'll be getting to in their own way.
It's just like voting in general, man. Pick between the shit.
I think we could start with maybe some like clarifying things, but like we've got to understand these societies are like so far removed from our modern conceptions of morality and so on, and like everyone's kind of got this idea. It's like, oh, Ulfric's a dictator, ooh, like all kings are dictators. What do you think an emperor is? You know what I mean? Like they're like it's an empire. It's all dictators. It's empires, kings, barons.
Even the Elder Council. Even the Elder Council sounds very like corrupt and Illuminati anyway.
Yeah.
When you
look, there's limited
things like
there's levels of bureaucracy all around. Like you could think of like the Dark Elves and their councils and so on, or like the Elder Council, and so on. Like obviously there's variations, but at the end of the day, the Emperor's in charge, the King's in charge, the Jarl or whatever, or whoever they are in service to or vassal of.
Like, if we're taking it all the way back, both of the factions we're talking about today don't necessarily have an innate right to the place they're fighting for. The Nords, they've obviously been in Skyrim a lot longer than the Imperials would have been in Skyrim, but even they took Skyrim from some bloody stuff. That Isgramor guy, he had a bit of blood on his hands. There's a lot of mess to go through. I mean,
I suppose a good thing to get out of the way early on is the whole idea of the Stormcloaks and how obviously many of them are xenophobic and racist types, and obviously we're not justifying that or saying that's good. However, I think what a lot of people miss is that so is the Empire in terms of their actions, maybe not the philosophy that they promote, but at the end of the day they are a bit of like a culture destroying machine, like a big empire, like a colonialist, right?
Well, on the topic of like colonialism and imperialism, I was thinking about that a bit, and like obviously the kind of Monty Python meme comes up when it's like, oh, what have the Romans done for us? And then you list off all these amazing things they've done, like on top of all the bloodshed. But then in the Elder Scrolls universe, it's a bit different because there aren't really technological advancements. You can't be like, oh, they gave us irrigation and medicine and that you can't really give them many benefits. Like when it comes to their imperialism, you could maybe make the argument that in Blackmarsh, they built roads, they tried to establish trade routes, but in the end it all failed. The Argonians didn't want it in the first place, and then it just became a prison state.
I suppose at the end of the day, you have to think like, what's worse, and obviously both are bad, but on one hand you have mistreatment of certain people, like especially you see that in Windhelm with the Dark Elves and the Argonians, or on the other hand going into another province that isn't your province with massive force and kind of saying this is how we do things, and kind of you have to do things how we do things as well, which is what the Empire has been doing for a very long time. I mean, there's all kinds of characters you can meet in the Elder Scrolls. Like I remember making the video on the Whodunit quest, the Murder House Party quest in Oblivion, and there's the Dark Elf there, Davisi Dran, and she talks about Neville, who is a retired Imperial soldier, and she basically says like, I hate the Legion and everything it stands for. When those soldiers came to Morrowind, they persecuted my people and stole our lands. Neville may not be in the Legion anymore, but who knows what atrocities he committed. So my point is they're all bad guys in a way.
Yeah, like it's kind of like, to clarify, obviously racism's a very bad thing, but to believe that racism is exclusive to like just the Dark Elves or the Stormcloaks is so naive.
Oh, the Dark Elves are some of the most racist
Well, to top
people,
it off, actually,
in terms of
here's a point on the Empire, actually. But the Empire, as it is right now, is facilitating one of the most racist and xenophobic cultures in the world via the Thalmor. They are, in alliance with them, literally letting them walk around their land, and as justiciars, essentially like a Gestapo force, trying to come in and take Talos worshippers and so on, torture them, kill them, and so on.
They'll just murder you if you tell them that you're a Talos worshipper. If you go in Skyrim to one of the patrols and say, "I'll worship whoever they want," but the point there is, it's like, so if you're using the point that like Ulfric is racist, which is of course true, you've got to look at how the Empire is also facilitating the same thing. You know what I mean? It's like, because you can't use that. If it's like almost like if everyone's racist, then it's hard to use. There's obviously varying degrees, but it's hard to use that as your one and sole barometer of how you're going to judge each faction. You've got to take a more complex view of it. And I suppose we should obviously specify for those in the audience, like obviously we're aware that it is a different, you've got racism, aka we don't like the elves, and then you've got anti-freedom of religion, which isn't as much racism, but it's
just
anti-culture.
Like for
it's persecuting a way of thinking, a way of life, tradition. It's discrimination. I guess that's the word we should be using.
And on the racism topic, to throw a bone to the Nords as well, like this wasn't really Ulfric's doing, but after the Red Year, the High King of Skyrim decided to cede all of Skyrim's claim to Solstheim so that refugee Dunmer would have a place to go as well, which is kind of good. Like there's political reasons to do it as well, because it stops you looking bad if they take it by force and you look weak or whatever. But at the same time, it's like there were steps made to help the Dunmer. And honestly, I think it's the Stormcloaks' biggest mistake is being xenophobic towards the Dunmer, because they're in a time of need more than ever really in their past. And now would be a great time to make an alliance with them, to have them on your side, to do them favors. So then when they regain their power, you've got a really powerful ally. But
I mean, that's one of the, I guess, the cons of the Stormcloaks is it becomes hard to have a united people when you do discriminate against, a certain percentage of the population that could otherwise, be a part of it and be useful for your cause. Which is where the Empire shines, right? Because they'll accept anyone. But that's not to say that they all respect anyone. Yes, I know cannon fodder.
No, not just that. It's not that. Just that, like, who makes up the Imperial Council? I guarantee it's majority Imperials or Bretons or humans. Like, where are all the Khajiit and Argonian stuff down in Leyawen in the poorest slums and stuff? Like, it's very... There's these guys of... It's not comparable to call, like, the Empire some sort of, big multicultural kumbaya sort of system. It is purely practical and advantageous.
However, they can have, like, a Dark Elf Empress. Like, these things are possible. And they would never happen in a Stormcloak Skyrim, I guess, is my point. Well, like, the severity, it's this. We should also
classify there that we are talking about two very different organizations. One of them is, like, I guess in modern terms, like an international, it's funny to say, international empire. And the other is a coalition of essentially kings, Jarls, in the eastern Skyrim. Like, these are very different sized organizations in terms of scope and also the way they function. Because one like the Stormcloaks Rebellion is essentially an alliance of Eastern Skyrim who want to, liberate the Western Skyrim and then have their own right to, like, choose their own High King. And let's not beat around the bush. That's Ulfric. It's very clearly Ulfric. It's a very, like, populist sort of situation there. But
it's really easy to be from Skyrim's perspective. The political situation during the time of the Civil War, it's really easy to kind of see the Empire in a very positive light, because they're slightly weak at this point. They're essentially trying to, I don't know, they're trying to be the good guys. They're trying to be diplomatic and all that. When you think of them, you think of a diplomatic group. But then if you look back in time a little bit, when Tiber Septim was around and the Tiber Wars happened, what happened if you had a place that didn't want to be part of your empire? What if you have Somerset who are like, yeah, no, leave us alone? Oh, then you whip out the Numidium and just crush their cities and destroy them and subjugate them and bring them under your control by force. So it's like, if we had a game set there, we wouldn't love the Imperials probably.
I think from our like modern perspective, like, you know, in our real world, we can look at most empires and be like, yeah, that's a bad thing. Like the idea of going into somewhere, slaughtering a place until you have control of it, right? So like in its inception, the empire is not a good... It's not necessarily... What I'm saying is it doesn't stand on this sort of like moral good. I think the reason people think the Empire is so good in the Elder Scrolls is generally because you're on the side of the Empire in most of the games. Until Skyrim...
And they're cool.
They're cool.
They have the cool factor.
Yeah.
Like, there are cool elements about... I mean, you could say that about any faction, but, you know, you get put through this heroic Empire experience, you know?
And they were...
where you really feel like...
Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just saying, you feel like you're fighting for something good, you know? You're solving the Oblivion Crisis or, you know, whatever it is you're doing.
And they were like, you know, the Empire back in the early First Era, they were founded on really positive principles as well. You know, you've got this Elysian slave rebellion against the elves who clearly had too much, you know, it is the Aliens, but they had too much power and there needed to be a revolution. And when there was, Elysia tried to integrate all aspects of society, be it elven or human, and make something that worked together. But obviously, time passes. Being the Emperor is pretty appealing. You get people fighting over it and warring, and tons of people dying. And then,
well,
you know,
also we don't want to go like in terms of like imperial roots. It's the first empire, so not so much. But they turned into one of the most xenophobic, zealous bunch of people. They became like where the Elysian Order became inseparable from the Empire. And, you know, they were carried out slaughters of all these elves and all that kind of stuff.
Absolute
like
power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, well, there's big problems. And arguably, even you can look at, you know, if you want to talk about just its like principle, like its inception, like Tiber Septim, and there's the whole like Arcturian heresy and all of the like things that went on around there in its inception. But, you know, the Septim Empire was not, period throughout the Third Era, was not just this indisputably peaceful, better area. Like, you look at some of the horrific civil wars, like the War of the Red Diamond, which happened, and you have all of these different, you know, there's always problems with succession and so on. And it's, like, not really, like, our concern, but, like, an empire is dependent on expansion, and that's how they fund these great big legions and armies and so on, because they need their legions, they need to be doing something, you know, so they send them off to other countries and provinces to class. And when they did run out of civil wars and stuff to do, and when they did get to some periods of time of union, they went over to places like Akavir, and then Uriel V started the invasion of Akavir to do so, which is just further expansion and so on. And you might go like, oh, well, Akavir, snake people, whatever. But you are going to a foreign place and you're just trying to conquer unprovoked, just going to... Well, you could go like, well, they've attacked before, but, you know.
I think it doesn't help, too, that a lot of the Stormcloaks and Nords in general are the pale skin, blonde hair, blue-eyed types. So it almost feels a bit strange to think of them as being, I suppose, persecuted.
Yeah.
But the reality is their culture kind of is. I mean, especially like what you see in Windhelm, you see a lot of discrimination done by them as well. This is a bit of a side thing, but I was just thinking about this before the podcast. Why are the Argonians there? I don't mean that in like a rude way, as in like go away, but like wouldn't they have a much better life somewhere? Like if I was an Argonian, you know I love Argonians. My egg brothers
too
and
much.
sisters. But if I was an Argonian, right, I would leave. There are so many better places for an Argonian to be. I mean, you have an entire province. Of course, if you were born outside of Blackmarsh, you might say you don't really relate to it. But I would rather go to Blackmarsh and try and relate to it and live in this swamp where, you know, there's culture and I feel like I belong and I'm respected. And, you know, I feel safe, versus working on the docks and complaining that I get paid a tenth of what a Nord gets paid to do the same thing.
And
I just don't understand from their perspective why they choose to stay there. I don't
and that's
know.
like pretty clear in the creation stories as well. Like the Anuad very, very much makes it clear that the corner of Tamriel that belongs to the Hiss, the Black Marsh, is so alien to everything else. And like the idea of people from Black Marsh fitting in anywhere else kind of has never been suggested that it would ever really work properly.
Yeah, unless you're born so far outside of it, because then when you return, Black Marsh is alien to you. But still, I mean, I'd rather live in Cyrodiil. I don't know. There's so many other places that I would rather be.
Well, to pull it back on track a little bit about Empire versus Stormcloaks, I was thinking we should maybe like talk about some like maybe we should just try and get through some of the sort of fundamental things and like divide it up a little bit, because obviously there is sort of the economic and like practical reasons, and then there is all sort of like just their rhetoric and like philosophy and like what they sort of practice and preach. And like on one side you've got Ulfric and the Stormcloak Rebellion is very pro-Nord. It is very about the Nords, and it's about Nords for, Skyrim's for the Nords. They want to, rule themselves. They don't want the Empire. They don't want influence of the Thalmor via the Empire, which, by the way, is a very, very valid thing. I think people often, misunderstand that or sort of push that aside. But, like, imagine being someone, who does, like, worship Talos or whatever in Skyrim, or someone that does, and then all of a sudden secret police knock, knock, bang, I'm going to take you away and torture you in a fort until...
I mean, I think an easy way to think about it is just imagine... an activity you like being taken away. And I know this will sound almost comical, but imagine if some force was put in where you live and they said you can't play
your
games
Xbox
anymore.
What if your mum took your Xbox? What links would you be ready to go?
No, but seriously, like just imagine like things like this, or they say no internet at all in any capacity, and you just have to cop it, and like you wouldn't be happy about it. I know it sounds funny.
Yeah,
but,
it's a thing with empires in general, but especially with the Nords, who have always kind of been, even when they're part of the Empire, they've always been more like unified with them in that they've always supported each other, and the Empire has relied on the Nords a lot, just as much as, anyone would rely on the Empire. But, yeah, like, so the idea is that the unity is like, the Empire should then protect your values. If you're going to be a part of their organization, you're going to be strong together. You got to protect the values of the places that you go, whereas they're not doing that anymore.
Yeah,
they're not protecting Talos worship. So what's the benefit of having a weak empire in charge of you?
Could I just hop in first and say one of the downsides about about being part of the Empire anyway, as you saw in the Great War, is that when they need to protect themselves, the Heartland, Cyrodiil, they will pull forces out of your province. So you don't even have like a guarantee that they will protect you, because the second that their province is on the line that they care about more, they will take their defense away from you, and in that defense is there almost in place of your own. Like if the Stormcloaks existed, the Stormcloaks wouldn't be pulled out to help Cyrodiil, because they're the Stormcloaks. But the Empire, they can be commanded. If they're in Hammerfell, if they're in High Rock, Skyrim, they can just be pulled out.
Also, like the Nords have been, while we're talking about like erasure of culture, and we were talking about that before, but they've become increasingly imperialized. And they're to the point where Talos, which is an imperial god, really is their most important thing, which you can argue the lore reasons for that or whatnot.
It should be.
But anyway, the point is they are just actually fighting to worship an imperial god of the empire that they feel a part of, and so on. And
the god who started the empire.
Yeah, and one thing I want to quickly address, it leans a little bit more into the practical side, but everyone's got this real like, but they've just got to cop it and just take the worship in secret, or not at all, until the empire is strong and does something about it.
Which is
25 years, nearly my entire life worth of time. Justiciars have been patrolling through Skyrim and lands of Tamriel, locking up Talos worshippers. Like, how long do you think is reasonable to wait? And how fair is that?
Here's some perspective that everyone in the audience should relate to, I suppose, with lockdowns. But, I mean, you see how angry and upset people get with just another week or 2 weeks, or we're going to do a month lockdown or whatever. 25 years.
Yeah. Like, but it's completely... I don't think it's reasonable to go, they've just got to wait, 50 years by their time until it's there. It's like the interest of all of these individuals, the farmer who had their husband kidnapped and tortured and killed does not care about the Empire's larger goals. They want...
Also consider...
Sorry, go.
Sorry, yeah. No, I agree. I was just going to say, consider too that men don't live as long as elves. So playing the long game in that same way doesn't work for them. Some people... if you were 40 and then you're 65, you've spent, the rest of your life essentially, and then you die at some point, not worshipping your god. Now, obviously, we know a lot of Imperials are Nords, and they do worship Talos just in secret. So there is that view of it.
Yeah.
But you can feel how you would feel very like culturally oppressed.
It seems like the Red Guards and the Nords both kind of came to this conclusion at similar times, realizing that, wow, okay, so when you've got an empire, it kind of weakens all of the sovereign nations, all of the sovereign provinces, because then you've got this, as you said earlier, they can pull out their troops at any time. And you're like, oh crap, we didn't really prepare to protect ourselves. And now that the empire is too weak to look after its vassal states, Hammerfell are like, oh, well, we're going to do our own thing. We've got to protect our own interests. And that's fine. We expect them to do that because Hammerfell the Red Guards were getting absolutely screwed by the White Gold Concorder. And then obviously they pulled out, they fought on their own, and then they got a much better deal with the Old Merry Dominion. And really, when you think about it from not a gameplay perspective, because we didn't see it in game, you're like, well, yeah, why wouldn't they do that? That makes total sense for them. But the Stormcloaks are kind of now doing the same thing. And if it wasn't for some of their xenophobic attitudes, it's really hard to question why they would do it. And then you've got Ulfric as well, who's kind of got his own personal motivations to push this into action. But obviously the people got behind him, or a lot of the people have gotten behind him. So there's obviously something there beyond his personal gripes.
I feel like some hybrid force would be the best. Obviously, like, it may never come to fruition because the incentive might not be there, but it would be interesting, if Skyrim had some Stormcloak type force of guards who were respected by the Empire and kind of just there. Obviously, this isn't compatible with the White Gold Concorder. I'm just speaking more in general terms. So then if Empire forces are pulled out of Skyrim, they don't have to take kind of like,
that's
a crux of guards who can stay behind.
That's where the Thalmor, I think, really nailed it, is because they, with the Empire's weakness, they really made it seem like they were in an incredibly strong position and had a throttle on the Empire. But things weren't fantastic for them. Had the Nords and the Empire and maybe High Rock stuck together and, maybe like worked alongside Hammerfell, the Old Merry Dominion would be at an impasse. They wouldn't really be able to continue, if the idea is that they're trying to conquer all of Tamriel, they'd kind of run out of places to go. But the Thalmor are really benefiting from the fact that the Empire and the Stormcloaks are fighting, so they can work elsewhere, let them fight it out, be distracted. I think there's literally a quote saying that they want Skyrim divided and distracted. And this just gives them time to kind of wrap around. And when they eventually do want to take Skyrim, if that's what they're working towards, it's going to be a lot easier after all of this.
Yeah, well, there's this idea that both sides, too, are kind of like biding their time and preparing. Like, even the Empire, the idea you get from Tullius and Rike and others is that, they're kind of preparing. And they don't trust the Thalmor. Tullius says he doesn't trust the Thalmor. They're uneasy about the alliance, but it's almost like, if two people were having a fight and they were both just completely like gassed, and you're like, you know what? Let's both take a breather.
Yeah.
And we'll come back and fight when we're ready. It's interesting the Thalmor actually refer to the Great War as, I think, the First Great War. Almost like they know there's a second one coming. You know, it's like the World War. You wouldn't be like, oh, the First World War if you were living then. It would just be the World War. So it is interesting. And I do like, though, that a lot of Nords tend to actually side with the Empire still. Because I will just dispel, there's this idea that the Stormcloaks kind of have this massive home advantage, and that, to defend Skyrim, the Empire is not aware of, the home territory and the terrain and all this. And it's like, yeah, they are. Like, a lot of Imperials, as in the Legion, are Nords from Skyrim who fought in the Great War and have lived their whole life in Skyrim. Like, they definitely do understand Skyrim. Tullius may not understand the culture necessarily in the same way, but he hasn't been there for long. And let's give credit where credit's due. Tullius was there, according to Hadvar at least, for a few months. And by the time Skyrim takes place, he's already captured the leader, Ulfric, and has him on a cart on his way to be executed. And according to Hadvar, he didn't even put up that much of a fight, like so much For Honor type thing. And if it wasn't for Alduin coming to save the day, Tullius would have put down this rebellion in 3 months.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting too. I think it's a good point. Actually, a perfect time to talk about the Ulfric, the dossier, the Thalmor dossier on Ulfric, because people, I think, misinterpret this a lot. But one of the things there, the Thalmor say as a note, is like they were there. They wanted to intervene and stop the execution happening because that was against their interests. They liked the civil war continuing and so on, and they just really lucked out with Alduin's appearance. But one of the things people, I think, misinterpret because they see the words asset, they kind of tend to think like agent or secret agent.
Like
it's
spy,
an asset to them in the way that him functioning and leading this rebellion is an asset to them. It's not like this sort of like secret agent that like Ulfric, you secretly want to help the Thalmor or so on. He's been tricked and manipulated. Like in the prisons, he was led to believe the information he gave up after being tortured was critical for destroying the Imperial city, or sorry, taking it over. But it was actually, it already fell. But he is very much like, he's wrapped up in all of his like, pro-Nor like kind of stuff. He's not some secret Thalmor agent. It's just beneficial for the Thalmor in their assessment.
Yeah, and they could see that they strategically created this kind of like guilt-ridden person, by telling him that it's his fault. He was incredibly pro-Empire, and he was obviously a lot younger when he fought in the Great War.
Yeah,
and so obviously you would give up secrets being tortured, but he would have felt terrible about it, especially because, Nords and their sense of honor and pride. But obviously, magical torture and things like this, obviously, you can break someone eventually and they will give up secrets. And now you can almost imagine that he just really, really hates the Empire, but from that different perspective that no one else knows as well. The guilt. Yeah. It's like
the perfect storm as well, because the Empire, you can't even blame the Thalmor for everything, because the Empire actively betrayed him essentially. It's not the Empire as a whole, but you've got this Jarl of Markarth, who the Reachmen, who are kind of operating all this time as well, they want their own land back to they want it to be their own land, so they try to take Markarth. And the Jarl is like, oh, well, crap, I want to keep this, I want to continue to rule this place, so let's get Ulfric to come in, deal with all of the, get his hands dirty for us, and we'll promise him Talos worship, but we know we can't deliver on this promise. And then, oh, wow, he now hates you. That's odd, isn't it?
Yeah, because, the Force One, he literally took... Markarth would be, Reach-controlled without the intervention of Ulfric and his Stormcloaks, whose militia...
They had 2 peaceful years.
Yeah. So then they took... Yeah. But in that, they've been... And Ulfric's, by the way, too, his rebellion only started recently. He'd been continuing on and so on because he actually spent time in Imperial jail, had to deliver a eulogy for his father's death and stuff from prison and so on. And then when he was released, he came out and he became Jarl. But he's been running peacefully for a while with things. It hasn't... This rebellion's a very recent thing since he challenged Torrig, which, to be fair... Even if you forget the whole murder part of it, because it's I think the more convincing things there, it's pretty clear that he did challenge him. However, the challenge may as well have been murder. He had the thorn, he had the sword, he was an advanced warrior, and Torrig was a young boy or so on. So you can kind of, it's like that, technically, but what was Torrig going to do? Show he's weak and not accept a challenge in their old customs?
Especially because it's not even just that. Think about the afterlife too. We don't know all the ins and outs, a checklist of what gets you into Sovngarde and what doesn't. But, it would have seemed pretty dishonorable for Torrig to turn down the challenge. So it's, like you said, he's pretty much just saying, you're going to die. And Torrig has to be okay. And you do meet Torrig in Sovngarde. There's actually a quote he has about Ulfric. He says, "When Ulfric Stormcloak with savage shout sent me here," which interestingly aligns with the idea that he was killed with a shout. You know how people say he was torn to pieces with a shout. "My sole regret was fair Elisif, left forlorn and weeping. I faced him fearlessly, my fate inescapable, yet my honor is unstained. Can Ulfric say the same?"
Yeah. That's the thing, but I think you can argue whether it was a misstep from Ulfric, because you do hear from Sybil Stentor and other people that Torrig was a big fan of Ulfric and would probably have given him what he wanted. But I was thinking about it, and I think for Ulfric, it was kind of an optical win, because not only would he kind of develop his own claim to be the High King, but if he's spouting all of this stuff about the true sons and daughters of Skyrim, embracing tradition and worshipping our gods, then bringing up this ancient custom of dueling and showing your might to rule very much aligns with everything else that he's been doing. Whereas if he just goes to the negotiating table with Torig, it may have actually helped his cause, but he wouldn't have seemed like such a great warrior to his followers.
I think it's pretty good to establish too, is that like Ulfric is clearly like an egomaniac, right? He wants to be High King and North of the Nords and all that kind of stuff, right? But just because there is an egomaniac at the head of, and is the face of it, it doesn't dismiss or disqualify all of the grievances that like people part of the rebellion may have. It's not necessarily just like he's a face. Like for example, the Gestapo Thalmor going around secret police style is really bad and affects their lives. The ability for them to not worship Talos and so on, the ability, and even strains on the Empire, like you were talking before. But imagine being sent off to fight the Thalmor. It's like, protect the Empire, and now you can't even worship, Imperial gods how you were used to doing, and
they would be incredibly peeved.
Like for example, I think no one has a problem with the Red Guards who fight the Thalmor and have got their own sovereignty, and most people are generally approving of that. Yet when it comes to the Nords, it's only because it's, obviously they've got to push off the Empire to do that, and then in comes the practical reasonings. Well, you've got to hold a strengthened Empire together. But, you might actually also come to the conclusion potentially that, like, look, the Empire is like pretty dying out anyway in ways. Like they've been slowly receding and failing for a long time, even before the Great War happened, and the Great War happens. And then at that too, like even if you want to talk about other things like, whether their justification or so on, the Mede Dynasty was just started by a warlord who won. It's simple as that. Like there is no sort of like, religious element to support their claim anymore with no more...
It would be interesting to know what Tiber Septim or Talos would actually think of the Empire in its current form. In Morrowind, there is this like avatar of Talos called Wolf, this Imperial warrior, and he has an interesting quote which I actually quite like because it can kind of reflect onto the whole situation. But he says, "The Emperor is getting old. Don't know how much longer he'll hang on. So is the whole Empire, for that matter, getting old, that is. The Emperor and the legions have held the Empire together for hundreds of years. It's been a good thing, by and large, but maybe it's time for a change. Time for something young and new. What? No idea. Because I'm old. Old dog doesn't get new ideas, but maybe young folks like you should try some new ideas. I don't know. Could be messy, but change is never pretty." Ooh, interesting.
Well, I guess we're kind of already on the practical side of things, so we could maybe discuss this a little bit more. But like one of the main points of contention is people want to argue how much, like whether Skyrim could stand on its own, or whether once the Pale Pass is cleared that the Empire will just come in and take over everything. So there is this note. So there's Fort Newgrad is this place. It's just run by bandits, but depending on which side of the Civil War you choose and win the area for, the Stormcloaks or Imperials come in, and then there's changes some of the stuff in the environment. And if the Stormcloaks win, there's a Stormcloak missive, and the part I want to talk about says, "But now I have word of a new Imperial force assembling in the south, ready to advance on our position as Pale Pass is clear. Send reinforcements or all our gains will be for naught." But to me, I think people kind of go like, oh, hands down, they're going to lose if the Imperial reinforcements come. But the whole like idea that they could even send reinforcements and all our gains are for naught kind of thing, I feel like they could hold that land potentially. Like Skyrim is a very mountainous sort of region where it would be hard to move, huge swaths of army and supplies and stuff. That kind of stuff, like in real life, has been and can be leveraged to create. Well, not to get this sounds like get too political, but like Afghanistan and stuff recently. It's why that's a massive problem. It's this mountainous, inhospitable terrain. It's very hard to actually exercise proper, real control over things. In a similar way, perhaps it could do the same. Like, for example, the Jarls are all native, so they've got their own like localized kingdoms or control, but those have traditionally like bent the knee to Tiber Septim or Talos or so on and cooperated. But if they decide not to, it's not like entirely possible that they could just have there could be this Skyrim that is independent, that is able to defend itself. I don't think in some giant all-scale war with the Thalmor, but in the same way that the Red Guards were able to leverage their terrain and, you know, their fighting spirit and whatnot, they were able to stop the Thalmor from taking their land.
I'd almost picture it like the Eastern Front. You know, I'm not. There's no allegory there. I'm not comparing any groups to Nazis or Stalin or anything, but like simply the German armies having a lot of momentum, being the superior army in this battle or this series of battles, but then the land just takes its toll, and an army that's more disorganized can end up just completely routing you and causing you to, you know, retreat back to familiar land. And I feel like that would happen in Skyrim if you couldn't get them to come to the negotiating table.
Yeah, it's more...
I think people forget too that it's not like for a Stormcloak victory to go ahead that they have to then take Cyrodiil, now take the Somerset Isles and march all the way to Alinor, killing all elves in our way. Like, they can just take Skyrim and live in Skyrim and defend Skyrim. It's a lot easier to defend from that kind of province than it is, nor do they even need to go on and take other provinces. And it's actually interesting, but if you take the other side at Fort Newgrad, the Imperial missive is there instead. And it says, Pale Pass is all but closed due to avalanches in the mountains. We need more support or our garrison will not withstand another attack. Now, we don't actually, and this is why these debates go on, and why if you were watching this podcast hoping to end up with some solid 100% outcome, you're going to be disappointed, because there is a lot of interpretation. And I mean, that's what makes it interesting. That's what makes it fun. So we don't know the size of the Imperial forces that are on the other side. They could have massive amounts to just send through and just clean up Skyrim easily if they want to, or it could be much smaller. We just don't know.
Yeah.
We just don't.
I just it's one of those things. It's just one. I think at least the way I'm approaching a lot of this like sort of question and so on is I think a lot of people approach the Stormcloaks as it's like case closed. There's nothing redeemable about them. They're the bad guys, and they wouldn't be able to win or withstand anything anyway. And I just think both of those are highly debatable, and it's not as clear. And the Empire is not this holy sort of all great kind of thing from a both moral and even a practical perspective. Like,
And considering,
I mean,
go on.
So I was just going to say on the Empire side, like if I were to pick which one would be stronger, I probably would side with a reunified Empire, but I agree with you in the sense that it's not black and white. It's not even like 70-30. It's like you just don't know.
Yeah.
I think the Empire has a lot more experience at governing lands. I mean, obviously.
Yeah. But it's Empire too in that like, you know, this is the thing. An empire is almost like a collection of like, you know, foreign lands and so on under one ruler, whereas those individual lands can have their own interests. Even like, you know, the kingdoms of Hyrule currently are under the empire, but they too could have similar concerns and so on. And most of them, I think, the reason people do, and even when there are conquesting groups, conquesting empires that come into a land, the natives that generally end up siding with them, it's usually from a practical perspective. Like, you know, look at the things we can get, the trade we can get, the security you can get, and those things are all arguably true. Like, they're very, like, they can be good things, but you know, like if you play the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, it wasn't a pleasant experience. So the Redguard's getting taken over by Tiber Septim. You know, it's a complex issue.
Yeah, and I'll say it's also a shame that the Nords have kind of been diminished somewhat in the lore over time, especially with the whole kind of like dragons retcon and shouting and things like that. Because when you hear about all of the old legends of Nords and fighting against, you know, dark elves or, you know, orcs or whatever it may be, all the enemies that Nords have had, they had tongues and, you know, like they could like blow down siege walls with shouts and things like that. And imagining those kinds of Nords defending Skyrim from, you know, an old Miri Dominion invasion makes you think like, wow, like, you know, they could have a chance. And that's how you look at all lore, right? Like, oh, well, if this group was so much more powerful, then they would have just taken over everywhere, but they didn't. So obviously they weren't. Like, you know, we've often talked about with the Dwemer, if they just had these superpowers essentially and could just alter physics and do what they want, then they would have just won in all cases, which isn't true. But it's just a bit of a shame to think now that the Nords don't really have that ability, and it's such a special thing limited to a special few. I mean, there is, of course, the whole idea of the Dragonborn, and whoever the Dragonborn sides with, that's massive. If Dragonborn is a Stormcloak asset, then the Stormcloaks can definitely stand their ground. If it's an Empire thing, then the Empire will win. It is basically the tipping point.
I think considering all these circumstances, like with this civil war, there is no way the Empire want to be fighting it. They don't want to make enemies of the Nords. They don't want to make enemies of the Red Guards. And I mean, in an ideal world, they wouldn't have kind of turned on the Empire for letting them down, because at the end of the day, the Empire want to be able to stop the threat of the Aldmeri Dominion, but they don't have the strength to do it currently. And really, the only reason they're really fighting against the Nords is because they have to. You know, the Famils are not going to let them, oh, what, you're just going to let Skyrim worship these gods that you've promised us you wouldn't let them worship, etc., etc. So they're kind of, their hands are tied in this situation. And were they powerful enough to say no to the White Gold Concordat, then they would be fighting alongside the Red Guards and the Nords again to deal with the Aldmeri Dominion, because they're the great threat, not any of the others.
Yeah, and I mean, they were... Mead was criticized for that, I think, by the Red Guards, who believed that, you know, if he'd just kept on trying, they actually could have won without making that deal.
I believe it, for sure.
But who knows?
It's hard to make in the moment.
We just
like
don't
that judgment
know.
call, even. Like, even if in retrospect you could go like, you know, even if you could go, there's a pretty good chance they could have won. In the moment, it's hard. You don't have all that information. There's lots of stuff going on. You've just barely got back the Imperial city, and there's this massive war going on. It's kind of like you've been asked.
The Empire has been diminished greatly too. Like, even all the blades having their heads, you know, overturned and all over the floor. Like, their spy networks are destroyed. The Empire is in a precarious position.
That's why in Skyrim, the little symbol in the front, the little dragon symbol's cracked and crumbling.
It is a crumbling empire. And I think, because this is the thing, people often ask, what side are you on? Are you an Empire supporter or a Stormcloak supporter? And I just think, I don't know. I'm on the side of whatever character build I'm playing is role-playing. I don't really have a side for me because I don't live in the Elder Scrolls universe. But I think when I think about Elder Scrolls 6, you can think about what would make a better story. And I think having the Stormcloaks gain more control could be more interesting. You've just got more factions and parties going on and new alliances that could be made between different groups. But I'd be curious to hear what you two think. Do you think a Stormcloak, if they win, alliance with the Empire is actually like possible? I mean, you were just murdering each other. I know the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but I don't know. It's all very fresh. I suppose... Sorry, you go.
Sorry, I was just mean, I think that what's more likely is not an Imperial thing. If Solar Skyrim really does become completely Stormcloak controlled and independent, that I think that High Rock would soon follow suit. And follow just they've cut off by land routes completely, and I just feel like the sense of, you know, independence and stuff around, and a weakening empire as well. You no longer have like Nordic armies to call upon for your legions. I feel like the empire would quickly be restricted to just Cyrodiil, and I think if anything, you're more likely to get like a coalition of you know, the Skyrim and Hammerfell and perhaps High Rock kingdoms looking after the, you know, men and whatnot.
To add to that, I think the Imperials almost need to be humbled a little bit and consider maybe it's time to have a kingdom and not have an empire. Maybe it's time to, you know, because they always do, as we've said before, they end up looking out for their own interests first and foremost. You know, the White Gold Concordat was signed because they were in immediate danger, even though Skyrim, High Rock, and Northern Hammerfell weren't in immediate danger. So maybe if they weren't trying to impose their force on the other provinces, then they could be a kingdom and they can align now with the Red Guards, with the Bretons, with the Nords. And perhaps that's the best way forward.
Maybe even, you might even have, sort of what I was mentioning it before, I forgot to bring it up, but like how the Empire is kind of like an entity that's kind of above just nations, because even with Cyrodiil itself, you've got all of these different counts and so on that have before functioned more as kings or so on, and they've got their own cultures and so on. And then if you've even got larger groupings such as, like, you know, the Clovians versus Nibonese, and the Clovian estates before have literally been separate to the Empire in the case of the times of the Elysian Order. So, you know, maybe something like the Clovian estates seceding and something is very possible or likely. You know what I mean? Like, There's all
Yeah,
kinds of
it
cool
is
stuff.
interesting. Not to be a fearmonger, but if Bethesda loves the Elder Scrolls Online so much, it would be very scary to think if they were like, let's do Ebonheart Pact again, because the Dark Elves are kind of in the dark. Like, you know that they've obviously had all kinds of problems with the Argonians and the... Well, actually, there's why you definitely shouldn't do that. I don't think they'd be allying with the Argonians anytime soon. But yeah, who knows?
I think something to important. Like, at least this is my take on it. Like, one big take I think is that it is understandable and justifiable for someone to believe in either side. There are perspectives and ways. It also depends on what you value. Like, it's very easy to say, well, I don't care about religion, so therefore freedom of religion or being able to worship Talos or something isn't important. But, you know, in the same... And there's plenty of ways to go back and forth on that. And also, just because you're part of one doesn't mean you're complicit in all of its behaviors or crimes or whatever.
And that's a flaw of Ulfric's, because he totally would disagree with you. I think Ulfric sees his own weakness in surrendering that information in the Empire, and he hates that part of himself, and then therefore hates the Empire. You know how, like, you can... Do you know what I'm talking about psychologically? Like, he hates that weakness of bending to the Thalmor with the White Gold Concordat, because it's a reflection of what he did. On a deeper level, he did that. And therefore, to compensate for that, it's almost as if he's being way more brutal than he needs to be, because he never wants to be weak again, right? And so he goes and does the Markarth incident. And this could be Imperial propaganda, because there's a text written by an Imperial scholar. But it basically says, you know, Ulfric was saying, if you're not with us, you're against us. And he had everyone who didn't help him, doesn't mean they helped the enemy, but didn't help him,
Can I just also say, though, let's not pretend that the Imperials, the Empire, doesn't do the exact same shit. You know, they would absolutely invade a territory. Are you gonna bend the knee? Nope, bye, off with your head. Like, same deal.
No. It was after he captured it. I'm saying, like, imagine you go in and capture a city, and then you have peaceful civilians there. It's like, you didn't help me. Shopkeepers.
Yeah, the Empire, I would guarantee absolutely the Empire has done very similar things and get rid of people that are undesirables, because you're dealing with like the native population of Reachman there that have forever been a problem for the Nords, right? And they've always been fighting over. When they come in, it's like they want to get rid of the dissidents. Not justifying it, but it's most definitely...
Let's be real. We're all on the same page that they're both bad. My point is that, like, Ulfric is incredibly brutal, almost to a fault. I mean, it would be interesting if he had actually tried to talk to Torrig and, you know, ask for independence.
I think anyway, a lot of the stuff with the actual debate, it's better to, like, yes, the lead is important, but it's also like there are so many interests and like all of the, for example, the Stormcloak Rebellion is like led by Ulfric, but it is still in alliance with these other Jarls that are independent in their own right and rule their own Jarldoms, but they are in alliance. What's going to happen is, if he takes over Skyrim, then there is going to be a moot held where he's clearly going to be made king, but then he will become king of a land, sovereign, and so on. But you know, in the same way that we don't, the morality, I guess, of Titus Mead doesn't reflect the entirety of the Empire or whatever. Like, we don't use that as the judgment, because you'll go like, Ulfric's a racist, fanatical egomaniac, and then it's like, yeah, but like that doesn't immediately, you know. Yeah,
emperors can be like that too.
Exactly.
Of course. I guess the difference is, from a practical perspective, I don't know if this is just vibe, but I can't imagine the Stormcloak cause doing as well without Ulfric to rally behind. Whereas I can see, you know, as canon, which it definitely or probably is, where the Dark Brotherhood murder the Emperor, I can see him being just replaced with a new Emperor, perhaps a better one. Whereas I can't see that the same, like, oh, Ulfric's dead, we all rally behind Galmar, Stonefist. Like, he really is kind of like very important to the cause, which makes the cause more vulnerable. Like I said, Tullius was there for 3 months, or a few months, whatever that means, and rounded up Ulfric and almost had him killed. Like, goodbye, leader of the cause, which kind of really holds it together in terms of people's morale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, once I feel like it would be different once, if he succeeds in the rebellion, because then it's no longer a rebellion. He then, you know, they take over, and then the king is elected, and that king would be
Yeah.
him, and then there would be like lineage and other kinds of things.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
it's sovereign state, but like that's the other thing too. I feel like people want to, another part of the debate is the right to self rule or like sovereignty or so on, because like obviously the Skyrim is, they say like they're a vassal of the Empire, and so the Empire exercises power over them and says, you guys come here and come fight for our land against the Thalmor or whatnot, so on. And that's just, and part of the trade-off is, you get the benefits of being in the Empire and so on. But then when they are undermined by that very same Empire, you can see people's grievances. And that's why I think it's very like, and it's why it's fun to come out from a role-playing perspective. It's like, who are you in the world? Like, it's very hard to see if you weren't, if you were a Nord and, you'd had people taken by the Thalmor, or you've even like you were a veteran of the Great War and you gave all of this only for them to turn your back on you. You can absolutely see how their like plight is sympathetic and so on. But also in the same way, you can absolutely see the same thing from the Empire's perspective. It's not. I just think people reduce it to such a there's one or the other good about it. It's like it's really complex, and you're dealing with like a fantasy world in where it's all kings and barons and so on. It's so far removed from our, concept.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard not to like turn all fantasy to make it allegorical and like, oh, you've got these blonde-haired, blue-eyed ones. Who, they're racist. Yeah, we don't like them, but a different group are looking out for their own interests, and that's fine. It's like everyone in this situation is looking out for their own interests, and if anything, like really at the end of the day, it's not Imperials versus Stormcloaks, it's Thalmor versus Stormcloaks. Essentially, it's like Imperials are just there because they're the puppet. They've got no power. Their hands are being forced, and at the end of the day, everyone really should be turning their attention on the real problem.
Well, that's the thing. Like the Thalmor, like indisputably, it's kind of like if the Thalmor get in, they are probably the worst of all and the closest to moral evil. Like even amongst their own kind, they have these strict caste structures, and their whole religion and faith and culture is based on a structure of like betters and lessers, and that's how they formed their very own pantheon. It's only the ancestors worshipping the ancestors of their betters. Like so. And even in Valenwood and so on, they carry out like cleansings of like Bosmer that they see in Inferior or who aren't politically aligned with them. It's like, but
they're the most discriminatory group. Well, maybe not the most, but almost. But the Empire, out of all of Tamriel.
The Empire's capitulated to them in both the outlawing of Talos and allowing of Thalmor to just to police their own lands in order to keep in line with that agreement. And it's that you could.
One thing to think about. Is that
okay? I was just wanted to finish there. Is just that you could potentially you could make the argument that kind of Thalmor encroachment will only get worse and more intertwined with imperial politics, and you could argue it's like, well then you'd absolutely want to be free of them. You could argue that now, but
for sure. And I mean that's also, I was going to say, a spy network for the Thalmor. I mean, like think you talk about the Nords have the kind of home ground advantage or the home field advantage, but the Thalmor have been there for a very long time, walking around, looking over it all, and they would know all the land. They've got outposts, up north and near Solitude and all kinds of things. And I mean, you even see their spy network being used, like with Malborn and the Khajiit assassins sent to like take him out, and you have to rescue him. And that Khajiit is out near Windhelm. Like they've got Skyrim on lock in a sense.
Not to mention that every Thalmor person you talk to is absolutely insufferable. Like just talk to Ancano once, and I think the moral of this story and what we can all agree on is whether your characters tend to join the Imperial Legion or whether they join the Stormcloaks. We just hate the Thalmor, don't we? At the end of the day, we all agree on that.
Yeah,
But then you could even get into why the Thalmor are being angry.
I mean, if I were a high elf,
be justified.
If I were a high elf, and say you've been around for hundreds of years, and your grandparents were around when the Numidium destroyed your homeland, you'd probably not be a
But
super
then it's
fond
also-
of type septim. So
Yeah.
it just goes round and round. It's always the strong ones.
It's all perspective. It all comes back to perspective.
It does,
guys.
because some of them, like obviously a Thalmors is all rooted in like what is essentially like mythology or theology to them or whatever, but it's a more of a spiritual argument. Their justified hatred against the races of man being like the weakest souls, yada yada. Whereas I feel like what we tend to do, and probably should do, is exist more in the realm of material and like actions and things that are like happening more so, rather than like the sort of out there things. So you know what the implications.
I mean,
of
I suppose
that.
the difference in the Elder Scrolls world is that all that stuff's
But
real.
it's not necessarily true, their version of events. But that's the problem. Like their justification is that, you know, we were locked up in mortal flesh, bound by Lorcan, and Lorcan gathered his armies of weaker souls, which he called men, to fight against us, and this is why we're better than them. And then they started worshipping only their greatest ancestors, and that justifies their caste and all that kind of stuff. That is purely a religious kind of thing, perspective. It's not 100% confirmed truth. And in contrast to, you know, men that believe they were created by gods and you know, they enjoy mortality and so on. So, but whereas when it becomes something more material and grounded, we can talk about, like, you know, whether it's just like, you know, are the Nords being like racist and so on. You know, are there, you know, well, not the Nords broadly, the Stormcloaks. It's more like, even more so, I guess it's fairer to say even Windhelm, like at least with the Argonians, a Grey Quarter, it's a very Windhelm, a greater, you know, specific problem. But that's also like, you know, let's not pretend Nords in other areas can't be, you know, racist or discriminatory on, and you know, then you bring in all discriminations of religion and freedom of religion and stuff as well.
Hey, a wise Argonian once said, "Why do Khajiit lick their butts?"
Yeah, well, I mean that.
Like this guy. No, I just mean in the sense that this stuff is everywhere.
Yeah, show us a perfectly
Darji. I think it wasn't his name, Darji.
Show us a perfectly pure group or race or anything in the Elder Scrolls, and you know, we'll support them. But none exist.
Yeah, there's no moral arbiters in the Elder Scrolls. I mean, look at the Empire. They came into Morrowind, and then they're like, you know what? Let's sign a deal. We'll get the Numidium, and you can keep your slavery and so on, with no regard for it. They're like, whatever. They're obviously not. You know, it's all incentives and perspectives and interests and so on that all vary greatly. But it's a hard one to talk about. But I do think generally the discussion, there is this sort of very non-critical view of the Empire, which I think there should be more of. I think, to be honest, though, because there was a person, there was TJ Supertramp, who says, "I'd love to hear your honest to goodness opinions on which side you'd each take, and analysis, yada yada." But basically explaining like what we would actually take. And I think obviously this largely depends on perspective or so on, but let's assume you're even a Nord and you're a Nord in Skyrim. Like me personally, I think I'd probably be pro Empire, because I'd enjoy a larger trade network. I'd rather, like, let's not have a civil war. Can we just have peace, like, on chill and so on? And me personally, I'm not religious, so it might not play. But arguably, if I was in the Elder Scrolls universe, perhaps that might be more important and so on. But like, I don't think I'd want to join a rebellion who's already, I guess it's already risky chances to fight against an empire or so on and go off and die. You know, I'd rather sit there with a law book and and write tomes and stuff.
I pretty much agree exactly with that. Like, if I was being completely honest, I'd be a conscientious objector and just I'd be too, basically because I'd be too much of a coward and like, I'm not going to die for a cause. You know?
Maybe you'd feel different if your family was like just, you know, killed for being Talos worshippers by Thalmor.
That's why I find these questions a bit difficult to answer, because you're going, imagine if you were a Nord, but then you're not. Like, you're just putting yourself in there.
There's plenty of Nords.
Or you're born a Nord, but your life experiences so far seem to feel like they're just the ones that you've had already. Like, they're not like the Skyrim life experience, like having your family murdered.
But that's not
that's
not all of them. Like half of the, because half of Skyrim, like the whole western side, is completely.
I just feel like like I said before, nothing is certain, and the Stormcloaks absolutely have a case. But from all the research I've done, I feel like the chances of beating the Thalmor, at least to me, weigh slightly more towards the Empire. And so I feel like I would be more like the Rike type, who's like, you know, you can be a proud Nord, but I still think the Empire has the best chance of getting us out of this. And I've fought alongside Ulfric, and now he's become this kind of like, you know, egomaniac type, and it's not the kind of Skyrim that I want.
Yeah.
But
Well,
But then,
you know
and then,
how-
then, oh, sorry, go.
Oh, I was just gonna say, you know how in season unending you can send what's her name, Ellen. Wait, what's the Falmer agent's name?
Ellenwood.
Ellenwood.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. You can send her away. Like ideally, if I were in that position to make that decision, I'd send her away. Try to get them to be like, look, we're all here. You're both pretty powerful. Let's shake hands, turn our attention,
Yeah.
kill her immediately. Let's do that now. And then, that's the ideal circumstance.
But see, this is another thing. I guess if you want to expand a tiny bit further, is that I don't think there is a as much as, for example, I don't think that they would allow Eastern Skyrim to secede. Like, imagine if that was a possibility. Okay, you four Eastern Holds, you're not part of the Empire, but you can't come and like, attack the other holds and have them, secede. But I don't think the Empire wants that. They're like, hell no, you're not seceding at all. So I don't think they'd ever come to that sort of agreement, which is, interesting, because perhaps that, like we've sort of talked about, I think Season Unending is a sort of more interesting political layout just for like story reasons. But, then the Empire's still got, if the Empire still has Solitude and Whiterun and all of that, and then the Stormcloaks.
Say the Empire just suddenly said right now, like during the midst of the Civil War, we're going to let you worship Talos. Do you think that would be enough to de-escalate everything and bring the Stormcloaks around?
I think that would de-escalate a lot. Like, you might sort of see things like, maybe Ulfric might even throw some shade, being like, this has happened before or whatever, and they might not trust it immediately or so on. But, like, I feel like he would be, that generally the people would be not, emboldened to fight against their brothers and sisters if they can actually.
Well, then you maybe wouldn't have to worry about parts of Skyrim seceding from the Empire. Maybe you'd have... that whole crisis would be averted simply by giving back Talos worship and pushing out the Justiciars.
Because I think the big thing amongst the populace really is like, how is like being in the Empire infringing on their rights or whatever. It's basically the Talos thing. But outside of that, the whole idea of the sort of vague kind of like, return to sort of true ways, true Nord, we need a strong king kind of stuff, only works on top of the Talos stuff for the most popular, I think. Otherwise, I think that'd be...
Because they still have their High King, but before all of the problems arose, even if they were a very imperialized culture.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
That's the thing. It would be more epic if they weren't so imperialized by the time of Skyrim.
Yeah.
Because, it just feels weird when they're fighting for our old traditions, and it's like the only guy you meet who is like the Kine quest, and he's like is it Froki's shack? Yeah, and it's like there should have been 20 times more people like him.
It's funny though. In some ways, it's like not desirable, but like, and it is a cop out post because they weren't going to implement it. But imperialization does make it's an interesting case that, like, how like all like religions and cultures and stuff developed and people kind of like cherry pick the things they want. It's like, I want the ancient custom to duel and so on, and this is what makes a true Nord, but like not the rest of it and so on. But did you guys have any other areas to talk about in particular, or like, I'm sure that we're going to be told there's things we missed.
Oh, there are. Like, we could easily part 2 this stuff. I mean, maybe
that is a good idea. Sorry to interrupt.
Like reflect and then part 2.
Yeah, because then people like add in and we can respond to some people's like comments and stuff and sort of think about them more.
And could talk about like the further ramifications after the resolution of the conflict, depending on who wins.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was even going to say, just to add about Tullius, he doesn't seem to care that much about the Nords, and I suppose that's another feeling that you would have. Like, he cares about Skyrim in general, but I mean, like, just to quote, and it's good that he has Rikke there to kind of guide him. And again, I know he hasn't been there for long, but I mean, here are some quotes when he's like, "You Nords and your bloody sense of honor," or like, he has these kinds of things. There's a few quotes like that. Or, "Don't you Nords put any stock in your own traditions?"
That's ironic.
Like, well, yes, it is. He was talking about the Jagged Crown with that one. I'm just looking at such a huge page of quotes and I can't find the ones I want. But he has that general attitude of like the Nords traditions, or this annoyance I have to deal with. Or like, couldn't you just
bow down
like
bro?
that? Yeah, like sometimes, but in other ways he's also very competent. So, and that's the perfect thing. It's this bunch of flawed characters, flawed ideologies, flawed kind of macro situations with the Great War and the outcomes. There's no clear-cut answers to this, like some people believe, and that's what we love about the Elder Scrolls world, is that there is so much interpretation to be done.
Because it's hard. You can't. Everyone sort of has this sort of holier than thou, like up in the sky, like completely disconnected from perspective sort of view of things. But that's not like, a real account. One extra question. Someone asked on Twitter. But whether we think, and I think this is important for the future discussion, but whether we think the Empire is the same entity that Tiber Septim founded. I'd probably, like me personally, I'd probably argue closer to no. Like, I don't think.
That's why I said, what would he think before?
Yeah.
Like, what would he think of the Empire today? Like, is it his empire
Well,
anymore?
I'd say no, because it's not related to the dynasty. But even, like, I mean, there's even arguable things how the Septim dynasty doesn't even descend from Tiber Septim. It actually descends from Tiber Septim's brother via his niece. But that because the line gets basically broken at Pelagius when he gets assassinated by the Dark Brotherhood, but early in the Third Era. But one thing to sort of think about is, there is no sort of religious element to your justification as emperor. Like a lot of, before you were ordained by the gods, the impact with Akatosh, you've got dragon blood, you are ordained by the gods. So even the Septims that did come after, they were like blessed or whatever with the dragon blood to continue. They could wear the amulet of kings, but there is no such sort of religious kind of divine justification either for the Mede dynasty. It may as well just be as good as any other king or other organization.
How about the Dragonborn becomes emperor?
Yeah. It's good. Yeah.
The only reason I guess that wouldn't work is just because of all the races everyone's picked. It's like we don't know what race the emperor is, but he's going to be important for the story going forward.
It's also kind of funny too, but everyone generally is very opposed to the idea that might makes right, and then whatever you should, only the mightiest should rule and so on. But then when it comes to the last Dragonborn, they're like, oh well, he's really powerful, and he's Dragonborn. Well, he should rule. What does he know about ruling shit? You know what I mean? Or he or she, like, exactly. It's like
absolutely. But I mean, it's
the same thing.
It is what it is.
It's like I think what would help is for people try and get down to like something consistent sort of criticism or application.
Put yourself in other people's shoes and then try and build a coherent philosophy around it that doesn't have holes in it, looking at all the different things. Because totally agree. People jump from Empire's bad because this, and the Stormcloaks do the same thing. Stormcloaks bad because this, Empire does the same thing. Yeah,
it's literally, it's like, imperialism and like colonialism, this is all really, really terrible, but I love it when the Septim Empire does it. But if the Empire from Star Wars does it, it's bad. Like, it's like you just pick and choose your empire depending on who you're told to like.
Well, it depends what music's playing in the background. If it's
exactly.
If it's dun,
exactly,
then they're bad.
But if you want to take you need to be critical of it all and to really get a good perspective.
All right,
that sums it up pretty well.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely get down into the comments and respond to some of our takes and all of that kind of stuff, and just some extra points that we haven't talked about, because I reckon a part 2 could be really good, responding more specifically to your guys' comments, and we can explore those ideas more and so on. But
All social media links down in the description, as is a link to our Patreon and our merch if you want to help support the channel, and we look forward to nerding out with you all again very soon.